Hi, I'm Becky Johnson with Sweetheart Quilt Design Company, and today we're doing the second in our series of 8 videos on binding. Today we're going to talk about how to calculate how much fabric you need, how many strips you need to cut for a binding, and then how to put the binding together so it's ready for your quilt. So I decided I'd work with this little quilt to do this. This is a quilt that I made with my Star Blast pattern. It's just a fun pattern to do. So this quilt, I have a calculation sheet here, and this quilt measures 47 by 59. So the way what we need to do is compute the perimeter, the outside edges of the quilt. So we're going to do 47 times 2 because that's the top and the bottom, and 59 times 2 for both sides, and then total it out. So we come out with 212 inches. Then we're going to divide by 40. Now the reason we're dividing by 40, most fabric's 42 inches wide, and we're going to cut those strips, but then we need to put in a seam. So we're going to divide by 40, and it came out to 5.3. And what you want to do there is you want to round up, because you're going to need a little extra for the corners and the overlap at the end, or the sewing. It won't overlap, but the sewing at the end. So we need 6 strips, 2.5 inches wide. So 6 times 2.5 is 15 inches. That's what we need for the binding. So at that point in time, I would buy a half yard, which is 18 inches, to have enough to straighten the edge. And then in case my ruler slips and I have to cut an extra strip, that gives us enough. Okay? So we're going to go ahead. Here's my half yard of fabric. And it's folded in half still on the bolt fold. And what we're going to do is do a cleanup cut. So I'm lining up with the line of the ruler down here so I can see it. And then I'm going to do my crazy backward cleanup cut. And then we're going to go ahead and cut 6 2.5 inch strips. So I'm lining up down here and along the side. It's always exciting doing the binding because that's the last step, and then your quilt is finished. Okay. Oops. Okay, there's the 6. I'm going to go ahead and cut this last strip into a 2.5 inch strip, because if you've seen my videos on strip piecing and how to make that scrap quilt, it uses 2.5 inch strips. So rather than have an odd shape, I'll just put that in my container that I have to make quilts like that. Okay, so we've got our 6 strips. And what you want to do is just stack them on top of each other. And I'm not going to cut off the selvage edges now. I'll do that in a little bit after I've sewn it, and I'll show you why. So what we're going to do is take this first strip back, and don't pull it wildly and get all your strips out of order, because you want to work with them just going straight down the stack. So we're going to take the first one, and we're going to crisscross them like this, and then we're going to sew across this. And what I do, so we're going to sew from here to here. You don't want to sew this way, because then you just end up with these funny looking legs, but you want to sew so that these edges are on either side, the selvage edges, and we'll trim those off in a little bit. By leaving them on here, it shows me exactly where I need to stitch on both ends. It just makes it simpler. So we're going to stitch straight across. I think of it, and you can draw a line if you'd like, you can pin them if you like. The way that I do it is I just lay them like this together and I stitch. And I think of it like when you walk on a balance beam or the curb edge of the sidewalk and you're walking, balancing on there. And if you stare at your feet, you'll fall off. But if you look down to the end, you can walk it without falling off. So the same goes with sewing. If you get started here and then you look to here, you'll guide it pretty much straight through. And it doesn't have to be perfect, just really close. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to stitch each one of these and we'll work our way down the stack, picking up the end of one strip and the beginning of the next one. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. When you sew your binding together, it's best if you use a color that matches your binding or blends well with it, just so your stitching won't show. And it probably wouldn't show anyway because we're still going to fold the seam to one side. Okay, so then you see I'm going to pick up the end of this strip I already sewed and the next one. And you can see why you don't want to just pick it up and grab it and pull it, because then you won't know what the next one is. So just leave them in a nice little stack, and I crisscross them again, and whoops, got one folded under, and I'm going to go ahead and aim at the other side, and so I'm pretty good at eyeballing stuff. If that's not your forte, then go ahead and draw lines and pin them, and you'll get better results for you. I've also done this a few times. Okay, this is the last one. That one fast. Oops, didn't pull it over quite far enough. All right, then what we're gonna do, and I just use my scissors, and I come in and I cut off that, what would be a dog ear, and then on the other side, I trim off the dog ear, cut that apart, and just work my way through. So I'm just cutting it straight along the edge of the bottom strip, and then I'll come over here and cut straight on the edge of the top strip, and then cut them apart. All right, there we go. Now we're gonna head over to the iron. And then I just start at one end. Let's do it this way. And start ironing. Now what we're going to iron is we're gonna iron out any wrinkles, and we're gonna iron out these bolt folds, and we're gonna press the seams to one side. So I'm gonna go ahead and then I'll just pull it down and let it go off the side. and you just press that seam to one side. We do want a diagonal seam in our binding because by the time we finish sewing it on and then wrapping it around from the back or the front to the back, we're going to have 6 layers of fabric there. And if you use a straight seam in your binding, you'll end up with about 1/8 of an inch bump right there. But by using a diagonal seam, then we're spreading out the thickness of those seam allowances. All right. Now, the next step that most quilters do is they take this and press it in half like this, okay? I never started out as a beginning quilter doing that, so I still don't do it. 2 reasons. One, it just takes some time and it's easy to burn your fingers with the steam, and so just laziness, I guess. But the other reason is that when you take it and you sew it on and then you wrap it this way and you wrap it that way, because one of the fabric pieces is going around the outside, the final fold actually shifts, and so that fold shows on the outside of your binding. So that's the real legitimate reason. All right, so then I like to roll my binding up so that I can store it. And you want to make sure with your bindings a couple of things. First of all, when you buy your quilt top, buy your fabric for your binding, because this year's teal won't be available next year. It's just like the clothing market. So you want to make sure you buy everything. And the other thing you want to make sure you do is when you make your quilt, make your binding, because otherwise you'll see this adorable fabric, a half yard of it. Oh, that'll fit right into my next quilt, and you'll use that, and then you'll be in the same boat. You won't be able to find anything that matches your quilt. So go ahead and make it into a binding, and make sure and put a little label on it so you know which quilt it goes with. Now what I do is I just wrap it around my hand like this to bind it. Now one of the things that you'll notice real quickly is this starts twisting, and you know, I've stood on a chair before to get these twists out, but actually the very simple solution is you just switch hands, and then when you keep winding, it'll still twist it, but it twists it the other direction. So it untwists what you'd already gotten twisted up, and then twists it the other way. So then when it starts getting twisted, you just switch hands again and it'll untwist. So real easy to do. And this works. If you folded your binding in half, pressed it in half, this still works. And I have found that with most beginning quilters, it's easier for them to manage a binding as they sew it on if they've pressed it in half. So you can make your own decision about that. Either way works. All right, so that's how you make a binding with straight strips. Thank you very much. We'll see you in the next video.